Welcome to Elevating Voices in Memoir and Fiction. I'm Joelle Tamrez, and on this channel, I interview up-and-coming authors. Today, my guest is Lucy Weldon, who's just published her short story collection, Ultramarine, on the 5th of May. Welcome, Lucy.
Hi, Joelle. Thanks so much for inviting me on your podcast.
Thank you for joining us. So, Ultramarine is an exquisite collection of stories set around the globe, and they touch on some of the most pressing issues of our time. Things like climate change, terrorism, migration, and the Arab-Israeli crisis. But at the heart of each story is our common human need for connection, our desire to feel and express love. Lucy, you're a journalist and you're a nonfiction author. How did you pivot to writing fiction?
So we'll have to rewind right from the beginning. And I had a very literature-orientated education, so I was steeped up into degree level into English, French, Spanish, Latin American literature. And I come from a very bookish family, got bookworm genetics. And then what happened when I graduated is I went into banking, and I was a square peg round hole, even though I was, I did quite well there. And I specialized in a particular sector, which was private banking. And I was invited in my early 30s to write a book on private banking. So that got me caught, so to speak, into nonfiction. And then what happened is I went overseas and I had to reinvent myself professionally. So I used the writing as an initial pivot, and I went into journalism, as you say, but I covered quite a different range of topics. So I did Asian financial markets, China Morning Post in Hong Kong, and covered education. And then I had the most fantastic time blogging, before blogging was a word, on the performing arts scene in KL. So you can see that sort of trajectory. And then what happened was, with 20 years overseas, I couldn't always work properly, get formal work. So I did a lot of volunteering, and that's when I had my lived experience outside the gilded sort of existence of expatriate life, and all the things that you mentioned. I experienced very much directly when I lived in Turkey, Sydney, Indonesia. And then I had a midlife career crossroads, did a master's, and then you can see where the road is coming back in. There was a creative writing module. I met a Canadian woman called Barbara Turner-Veselago who introduced me to freefall writing, and I started writing again. And what happens, and I think you'll be interested in this as a memoir writer, is often when you start following this style of writing, you write a lot of autobiographical material. There's like a queuing system in your head. And then I guess you go with what you want to write, stay with that. Or for me, it was a way of clearing out and inviting in creativity and sort of decoupling myself from journalism, so to speak. So that's when I started writing short pieces, so leaning into the sort of journalist background, but creative fiction. And then I did a short story writing course.
That's a fascinating journey, Lucy. And how did you settle on the short story form?
Well, I suppose for want of anything else, I never imagined I could write anything long form. It looked overwhelming from where I was standing in the short form. So I mistakenly thought that that would be quite a straightforward transition. Little did I know that short story writing is probably one of the most challenging literary genres to write in. But I got hooked. So I did this course, and that's, when anyone does that kind of more intense experience, you're reading a lot of stories and then you're unpacking them. Then I got quite hooked. So my apprenticeship just started like that, and I never left. So I was comfortable with short form, but then I realized quite what I was getting myself into in terms of the diversity of the genre, the flexibility of the genre, and the challenge of the sheer brevity of it. So it was for want of just, I suppose, some self-doubt about the novel, Yeah.
But as you say, it's just as challenging. Ultramarine, which I'll hold up here, has 11 individual stories, each complete. And what I wanted to ask you is, how do you get your ideas for stories? Where do they come from?
So probably no different from other fiction writers, I'm guessing. So I've always been quite an observant and curious person, so that's really, really helpful. And, I just notice. I don't go anywhere without a pen. I have notebooks. I I read a lot. I go to the theatre, cinema. I'll hear things, in a conversation, and I'll just pick it up and make a note of it. And it doesn't mean I've got a home for it, but I just sort of gather like that. So it's about, when you sit on a train and look out the window and you solve, you know, world crises and things like that. It's that sort of thing. You just have to have mooch mode on, observation mode. And funny enough, I was watching telly the other night and there was a line in Succession and I went, oh, that's the funniest, best line ever, and I wrote it down. You just collect.
How do you pick one to pursue then? What's your process for writing?
So it's quite instinctive. So there's an energy, that I'll feel. And the idea could be in a number of ways. So in one of the stories, Busy Being Free, someone said about, oh, it's really funny. I was in this record shop, how it's all come back, record shops. And this guy came up to me and started talking. And I didn't really want to talk to him. And I said, oh, what did you do then? She went, oh, I walked off and went to the folk section. And I went, oh, that's there was something about that. I just thought it was, anyway, I parked it as an idea and it has come back into that story. And then The Sea Between the Lands, the second story, there was something around the process that I wanted. I thought, these sliding door moments, and I wanted two intertwined stories, and I thought, oh, that could be a really interesting way of writing a story. So there's a bit of a challenge there. And then as the collection grew, I had this other idea. So, they're not just about content or structure, but this was about point of view. And I thought so many of my stories were in the third person.
Yes.
I wanted to do something in the first person. And I wanted to do it from a male perspective as well. And just to make it extra difficult, I wanted to put it in Israel because I was building some kind of story that is not about the conflict, but contextually it added to the drama of the story. So the first person, and often short stories are written in the second person, which I haven't done yet. And it's in the back of my mind. So that's it's an idea around a story itself and then how it sits in the collection as well. Yeah.
And you do it very skillfully because we don't feel moving from one story to the next. I was unaware explicitly of the changes, say from third person to first person. It just happened.
Oh,
and as the reader,
that's interesting.
You're just taken in with what you're reading. And by the end, I was quite astounded how the stories did have echo moments with each other that on the surface of it, the stories aren't actually related.
Yeah, and then when you get into a short story that is in the second person, I find that quite clunky to read as a reader. And that's probably the hardest voice to do. So I will do it, I think. But anyway, so that's how it is around ideas and reading a lot. It's amazing. I can switch my brain off and on. And I know when I'm reading something that I know it's nurturing me, but not every book does it. I'll go, oh yeah, no, this is so interesting, and I can feel my creative head going with this writer. So I think it's always said that if you write, you need to read a lot, and I do.
And do you find those nurturing books you're actually reading quicker? You're just naturally absorbing them. You're not belaboring the process, or not necessarily.
So I try to read as a reader. It's quite hard to switch my writer head off. And the books that I really like to read, I read a lot of short stories, are the big sweeping arc stories, that it's the Americana, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I just finished Barbara Kingsolver, big stories. I like that. And but also I read lots of different stories and memoir. I do read some memoir.
Good, yeah. Yes, you can absorb from all the genres.
Yeah.
So, and how long approximately does it take you to write a story?
It's very difficult to say because some of the stories in Ultramarine I've been rewriting. So Hemingway said writing is rewriting, and he's absolutely right. So I was doing my apprenticeship, so things took quite a long time. So I've got some sort of recognizable steps. I go from idea into very much creative mode. So I follow that freefall writing of just writing, right? I don't go editing. I just continuous writing, and I don't look back over what I do either until a certain point. So I gather all my ideas, and like a potter with clay, I go, oh yeah, and I'm ready, I've got enough. Then I start the writing. Then of course what's in your head or in your notebook doesn't always amount to very much when you start writing, and you go, oh well, had an idea, but it's not a story. So there's a lot of difference between idea and story. You've got to go idea, premise, then what is the story about? And then that's when you start thinking about, what is your story about? Who are the characters? Who are they in relation to each other? You know, what's the plot? And that can change quite a lot. So your premise needs to be quite rock solid. So that can take a few months, you know. And I don't write all day. I find I'm early morning for a few hours, then I've got to go and dog walk. I mean, that's an essential element of writing. It's just, this is your mooch mode. You just go off. So the last story I wrote was Omar's Piano.
Okay.
That had a genesis in a different story that I basically canned and then just rewrote, but it could be a number of months. And then the best advice I was ever given was put it in a drawer and go away and leave it, and then come back to it, because then you get some perspective. And then I get into more intentional mode. So I go from creative to intentional. Well, I go back in and I go, oh, that doesn't hang together. So it's quite critical in a way, and I'm critiquing. And then I get into, am I starting in the right place? Am I ending too late? Where's the tension? All those are pieces of advice an editor gave me. You know, when something's really important in a story, slow it right down. If it's not important, go fast. And then I mark it up, you know, for beats and energy. So I really sort of almost grid it. So that's a different headspace. And then, of course, you know what it's like. You then show beta readers. I had each story read by not so much a sensitivity reader, but someone who could validate language, culture, some of the angles, you know. So, you know, you could have a tense 3 or 4 months and then you've got to park it for a little bit. So I feel I'm quite slow. You know, Stephen King once said, oh, I sat down and wrote the story all in one go. Well, I barely write 1,000 words in one go.
1,000 words is a good number in one go.
I hope I didn't invent that.
Yeah, it sounds good. It sounds good. And what about the title? What an incredible title. How did that come to you for your collection, Ultramarine?
Oh, well, I love it too. So short answer and long answer. Short answer is, it's, as you know, the title of my third story, and that's rooted into the character who's an art teacher who's a bit obsessed around colors.
Color.
You know, and she's on holiday, and you know, there's a bit of a piece around blue. And funny enough, I looked back over that story, and that's not what its original title was. It was originally C'est la vie, because there's a French element. Then it became Out of the Blue. And then the editor that I had at the time went, no, I think it's ultramarine, because it's just such a beautiful word. And of course, when you look into the meaning of ultramarine, you go back to its Latin name, ultramarinus, which means beyond the sea. There was a really deep, strong thread to the themes of the book, which is most of the characters come from beyond the sea, as we all have. You know, I'm thinking of my Dutch family and my father that was brought up in Morocco, first language Arabic. You know, we've come from all over the sea, and all the characters more or less are finding homes in different countries or returning from, you know, to a different country from another home. Bit of serendipity then, Joelle, in a way. It was fairly early on as a title for the collection, and often short stories use a title from a story. And, you know, it's so suggestive as well. A number of the stories do relate to the sea, but only probably a third do. So I needed something suggestive and literal as well.
Yeah, it works well that way.
And, well, it does, you know, and the story about, you know, the mine in Afghanistan, digging up lapis lazuli that comes on the back of donkeys, you know, all the way along the Silk Road to Renaissance Venice, where they made the pigment. It's a beautiful story. Yeah.
Once you're done with a story, do you ever feel like revisiting that particular setting or characters?
For another story?
Yes.
Yeah, so I sort of feel I have unfinished business with some of the characters, because often with short stories, you'll know what's happened before, and then sometimes you have to write ahead in order to end it properly in the story itself, you know. So I have sort of very early ideas about a couple of characters. One's in Dear Mr. President. I'm quite fond of Sakura. I sort of feel she's a woman that needs to be heard again in another place. And I think about her, you know, in the middle of the night when I'm thinking, what's next?
Yeah.
And yet she's a woman after my own heart. I mean, we're a different generation. She's a very feisty 30-year-old,
Yes.
but I like her.
What are some of your influences among short story writers?
So I knew you were going to ask me this. So it was really lovely to go back to some of the early stories that I first read. So the story Ultramarine is directly influenced by a story called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And she was an American writer in the 50s, and like a lot of women in the 50s, underrated. The light wasn't shone on her. And when you look at that story today, it would still be shocking today in terms of its premise. It's a fantastic story. The Stone Boy by Gina Berriault. George Saunders says that's the best, could be the best story ever. There's another one called, it's got quite a clunky title, but it's the most amazing story. And I tried to write a story similar to that. It's just so clever. It's called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. It's a wonderful story. Recitatif is the only short story published by Toni Morrison, very clever, about a white girl and a girl of color, and you don't know who is who in the story. She was ahead of the game when it came to talking about race. Yeah, and then collections. So if people are not familiar or would like to get into short stories, I think Hilary Mantel, who is known for historical fiction, her collection, the very punchy title, The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher. So she was not a conservative. It's a very, very, very good collection. Her writing is fantastic. Sarah Hall is an English writer from the Lake District. Shirley Hazard is an Australian writer, again, underrated. Curtis Sittenfeld, who we know who as a novelist as well, very funny. And then if you really are going to get nerdy, then you do have to check in on Hemingway, Alice Munro, and Chekhov as well, So there's sort of ones for learning and then ones for a bit more fun and enjoyment, I feel.
Excellent. Thank you for the recommendations. And can you tell us a bit about your path to publication?
I think I was steeped in realism and not hope. I knew it's like getting through an eye of a needle. And also, short stories is pretty nichey. So I did the usual research and thought, I am not going to get traditionally published, from a big publisher. They're not going to look at me. And I could see their point of view, not commercial enough. So it really boiled down very quickly to self-publishing, which I think is an excellent route. You will have as good a product as if it went through the traditional routes. There's no doubt about it, because all your editorials, resources, they all freelance and are all part of the traditional field. So you would get all the excellent expertise there. And then it's all the small indie presses. And I just happened to know a writer who was published through Cinnamon Press, and I like them. They are no fuss. They do not stick their heads above the parapet. I think their byline is something about distinctive voices. There was just something about them that I liked. And I went in for one of their short story writing competitions, and I think I was shortlisted or something like that. So I had a connection. So in the end, I think for me it mattered getting some kind of validation. They set a bar and you have to get over it. And then also just the work of publishing yourself, because I have a day job, elderly parents, family, life. I just thought, whoa, that's a lot of work. But I certainly think those two routes were very, very good routes that I took. So you're going to end up doing lots of marketing yourself anyway, regardless of who publishes you. And the other thing about, I'm sure anyone who subscribes to your channel will know this, it can be a very, very lengthy process, if you go the traditional route. And I had a sense of, come on, I'm ready. The only thing I can control is get the best possible collection out. And that's what I worked really hard at to do. So that's the only thing I could really control. And I wanted my work to speak for itself. And I had a bit of luck, I think, really. You just have to cross your fingers a bit. But definitely I felt confident that I couldn't do better than with my collection when I started to submit it.
Yes, and that's very well deserved that you were selected by Cinnamon Press.
Thank you.
It is a very sound and unusual collection. So I think you're offering something new into the marketplace.
Well, I was mindful about that too, to bring something different. And also, sometimes I think people find short stories quite difficult. And I really wanted to write great stories, a bit in that overarching, the sweeping story. I wanted each story to be just a really compelling read and invite the reader in and not leave them. I think I made a joke with you once about, and then the tomato walked down the road and you just go, nah, don't want endings like that. I'm thinking of the reader a lot,
Yeah.
with enough footholds in the stories. And yes, we leave you, because I think Laurie Moore said the short story is a love affair, a novel is a marriage. These love affairs don't last forever, but they may stay with you forever, in your heart or something like that. So that I had this premise in my head around that.
And that's also true for your characters, that they will
Well,
not
that's
their
great.
love affair.
Yeah, they are love affairs, and there are love affairs in there as well.
Yes. So what's next for you, Lucy?
So there's a lot to do around the marketing,
Mm.
an awful lot. So I need to do that, and I'm really quite desperate to get back to some writing. So I think probably in the summer I will get back to some writing, and I've got an idea around doing some genuinely interconnected stories where the characters come up in different stories, and it brings it all together into a sort of more of a novel feel. So I'm going to just experiment a bit. I read a novel called The Tsar of Love and Techno, and that was just slices of big stories, but they're all connected. And I enjoyed that. And I thought, I think I can have a bit of fun with the structure and bring the reader closer to a novel. Yeah, something like that. But who knows?
Well, that sounds like a great project, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it when you're ready. And on that note, I want to thank you for offering your insights, for sharing your process. This has been a great conversation. And thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you for inviting me, because you got me to think about things that I haven't really thought about. And that's just really helpful to sort of synthesize a bit and understand where I've come from to arrive here today. So really fun to do that. Thank you so much for having me.